It goes without saying that Rocco Silano is a modern sex god, not even as a magician, just as a person. Look at the man and tell me that this guy doesn't exude sexual masculine energy. Today we're going to be taking a look at his most famous 2006 FISM winning act. However, I do have to say that from the beginning, unfortunately, I can't play the same music that he has in his act, so I'm going to have to replace it with some generic royalty-free Italian music. I'm going to blame YouTube for making me racist and having me pick a very stereotypically Italian royalty-free sounding song. And right off the bat, we get an introduction as to Rocco's style of magic, which is hands empty, there's an object, and then that object is either transformed, vanished, or changed into something else. And Rocco's always very fair with his handlings, where you see his hands unequivocally empty, and then something appears in relation to that object. He does this with nuts, with matches, with cigarettes, with smoke, with milk, and here he does it with wine to grapes. It's no secret that he makes use of his sleeves throughout his entire act, and Rocco truly is second to none when it comes to using this technique. He was a student of Slidini, and he applied everything that he learned from the table and took it up to the stage where he was able to adapt it using his sleeves rather than the lapping techniques that Slidini was known for. Even something as simple as turning wine back into grapes becomes very impressive once you realize that his hands were unequivocally empty before he actually came onto stage and he was holding just a wine glass. But this is going to be the exact thing that you're going to realize throughout the entirety of his act, that his hands are empty and yet he's making all these things appear and transform, all while looking like an absolute Italian sex god. One thing that's absolutely bonkers about his act is that throughout the entirety of the set, he plays with the elements. So sometimes he produces things like ice, he produces things that are impossible, like liquids. You really can't manipulate liquids. And yet in this case, he's able to transform what is smoke from a cigarette into milk that then turns into a legitimate ice cream little sandwich there. And sometimes magicians would fake it and use a fake plastic prop. But no, Rocco wants to slap you with his Italian salami and show you that it is in fact a real ice cream treat and not just a plastic prop that a magician would go to just to cheat and be able to sleeve it a lot easier. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about having cigarettes in his sleeves, burning cigarettes, and ice cream that's melting, as long as he gets to the effect. Now, obviously, no one is ever going to do anything like this, and if you are, you should be ashamed of yourself because stop copying it. Be better. But there are little things that we could take from this, such as his approach to misdirection. Notice that every time he takes something out, he really devotes his entire energy to that object. He looks at it, he almost repositions his entire body so that he's giving that object a focus. That allows him to do whatever he wants and whatever he needs to do with the other hand, which might be loading his sleeve for another production. This is directly taken from the Slidini school of thought that puts a lot of emphasis on misdirection and where you are directing your energy in order to best facilitate the effect in the minds of the audience. Another thing that we could get from this act is that every time he goes to his pockets, he's loading up for the next effect. So every time you see him reach into his case or in his pocket, that's to load his sleeves for the next effect. Now, of course, if you're not necessarily doing sleeving, how could you apply this to your own magic? Well, the previous effect sets up the next effect. So in this case, he's producing some objects, reaching into his pocket. In this case, he's playing with some flash paper. That's already set up half of the next trick. And in this case, he's going to do the exact same thing with this piece of flash paper where he sets up the sleeve for the next production. So think about places in your current routine where the previous effect actually sets up the next effect. See, it's a very simple effect, but still made all the more impressive by the fact that he always shows his hands empty. So in this case, he turns this egg into another, I would say, simulated cooked egg, and his hands are still unequivocally empty. Although your hands should be full of the PigCake Magic Academy, the home of over 1,500 videos going over card stuff, coin stuff, everything you need to become the best magician you could possibly be, all for the low, low price of $5 a month. You get access to all those videos, and I'm always uploading new content. So it's not just those videos. You always get access to new content, more content than you could ever consume. Be a better magician and be a better person. Join the academy, help me out, and more importantly, help out yourself. Rocco mentions himself that he's very biblical when it comes to his approach to his magic. In this case, in this particular act, it's a lot of food. It's a lot of apparition of food, which if you remember from your Bible studies, you remember Jesus turning water into wine and then making a small barrel of fish and bread multiply for an entire audience. So it's very biblical in that sense. I've always personally appreciated the amount of elements that he manages to squeeze into his act, where he's not just turning one solid object into another, but different states of matter into another, which is very interesting because how do you manipulate smoke? There's also an inherent punniness in Rocco's act where he makes, for example, a pop with a wand, and then that turns into popcorn. And then, of course, because it's salty, he produces water or some sort of beverage. And then from that, he's able to turn the pop into the corn. You see, the corn appears from the popcorn. So there's a nice little punny logic that happens with Rocco in this entire act. And I think it's probably one of the best that I've seen. You always pick up something new with repeat viewings of this act. And I would argue that it's better knowing his different techniques, because now you're privy to his loads, privy to when he's doing something sneaky, and privy to when things are actually taking place behind the scenes to set up further effects. You really do gain a newfound appreciation for what is possible with such a simple technique like sleeving, especially when he gets to the point of the act where he starts producing real life ice cubes that are there and wet and frozen this late into his act. My goodness, what a sex god. And here we have a part of his act that is from a bygone era, which I miss. I miss being able to have a smoking section in Denny's or an airplane where there's an entire area where you could smoke a cigarette. Not that I've ever done that. I was too young for that. But I respect the freedom that we no longer have. But here we get to see Rocco's cigarette manipulation. And in this case, lit cigarette manipulation, where he's sleeving a lit cigarette, which is very impressive because if you have any idea as to maybe fabric and fire, you know that those are two things that don't go well together. And yet he's managed to find ways in order to sleeve cigarettes and make them vanish and reappear at his will while not burning his sleeves and while still keeping his hands unequivocally empty, which is the theme that he's had throughout the entirety of the act. And notice his logic here. His logic is still sound. He made a cigarette appear from sugar, and in this case, he turns that sugar into a lollipop. The theme here could be about indulgences, and in this case, a cigarette is an indulgence, as is a lollipop. So why not make one appear from the other? And in this case, he still manages to end with the production of a cigarette, even through the production of a pipe. My goodness, I can't get enough. Can you? Can you get enough? At this point, he's just showing off, but you see the versatility of his technique. So in this case, all he's doing the entire act is the exact same thing, which is load his sleeves and produce the object from a sleeve after showing a transformation or an appearance or a vanish or anything to that effect. And yet he's able to do so many different effects that you never get the impression that he's being monotonous or repeating anything. And all this was born from Slidini's techniques at the table. Of course, Rocco made his name by taking those same techniques and bringing them up to the stage where he's able to do it with his sleeves. Traditionally, the use of sleeves was always reserved for just maybe snapping a coin in there or making a set of flowers appear and then making yourself appear on the registry. Whereas Rocco took it to the next level and actually turned it into an art form. That's the thing about this particular technique, much like using a thumb tip, is that there's a certain improvisational quality that could come to it. For example, if you see something on a table or you see something in the environment that you happen to be in, sleeving really allows you to come up with effects that are organic or germane to that particular situation, or seemingly so. I always like to remind budding virgins that impromptu magic doesn't mean unrehearsed. It just means that you have the appearance of magic that exists in the moment, whereas it's something that you've cleverly practiced many times before. I've always loved this part of the act because Rocco is really playing with the elements. In this case, he makes ice appear. Now, usually, as I mentioned before, a magician would fake it and use maybe plastic bits that resemble ice. Not Rocco. Rocco uses legitimate ice, and this late into his act, it becomes even more impressive when you realize how, where, in what planet. And also, as I mentioned before, his manipulation of liquids. In this case, it's very difficult to move liquids around, and yet Rocco has found a way to do just that, where he makes, in this case, a lemon appear from lemon juice, and then he's going to make that turn into, if you want to call it, Italian ice, or he makes it turn into some sort of lemonade. Even when doing things like thumb tip work, anytime you have an opportunity to work with liquids, or maybe take something of a Coke and make it disappear or appear somewhere else, it's always much more impossible because people know that liquid just falls, that liquid is liquid. So for you to be able to hold it in some sort of state and make it appear in a different way or vanish in some other fashion is always impressive without you doing much work, just because of the state of the of his act, where he builds up very quickly to that wonderful moment where, of course, you can't help but get up and give him a standing ovation. And that production of the glass was also very impressive because he makes use of what seems to be a small accident. Now, that allows him to pick up the load on the table, and it seems very natural. So I'm sure he was probably racking his brain trying to figure out how to make another glass appear from seemingly empty hands. And that was such a wonderful approach in making it seem like a small little mistake. I suggest for you and your infinite virginity to watch this act multiple times and see if you could actually watch him perform it in different venues, because you're going to learn something new each and every single time, and you're going to get something new every time you see this act. Also, his Penguin live lecture is amazing. It just seems like he's a crazy homeless person with all these weird, crazy, zany props on a table, making a mess out of everything, but you're going to learn so much in terms of misdirection and how to stage an act and how to come up with these little connections that you can make for effects, much like my uncle has made connections with my bumhole.
I see you again, when 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 I see you again.